One of the hottest properties to emerge from Nintendo's experimental foray into two-screen gaming, the Wii U, was Splatoon. Despite hardware sales falling well short of forecasts, Splatoon, a fresh IP, emerged as one of its strongest selling titles. Its quirky mixture of ink-based combat and trendy humanoid squids proved a hit and the foundation for a new series. While Nintendo itself has described its origins in detail, this is the story of a previously unknown original Nintendo game that once could have taken its place, that some believe may even be connected to it. Before Splatoon's earliest of prototypes, Nintendo intended to bolster their feature lineup with a brand new first-party shooter and look to a team of developers with experience in the genre to realize it. 2011 saw Nintendo setting themselves up for the generation ahead. Their next home console, codenamed Project Cafe, was on the horizon, and so preparations to build its lineup of games were well underway. They sought to assemble a diverse first-party portfolio catering to a variety of different tastes. One genre they did not have covered, however, was shooters. With the Metroid Prime series on ice, Nintendo lacked an exclusive first-party shooter of any kind, something that had not gone unnoticed by their higher-ups. To rectify this, the company widened their search for a development team beyond their own studios. In March 2011, they tapped a third-party developer that had caught their attention in recent years. High Voltage Software had risen to prominence during the Wii's life cycle for championing the system and attempting to produce ambitious content for it that was geared towards core gamers. This began in 2009 with their original IP, The Conduit, a first-person shooter about uncovering an alien conspiracy. The game garnered no shortage of attention from the press, giving High Voltage an outlet to sing the console's praises and talk up their extensive plans to support it. In the short term, this strategy paid off for them. Some mixed opinions among critics didn't deter Wii owners from buying the Conduit and making it moderately successful. However, the company's fortunes would change for the worse over the 2 years that followed. Shortly before the Conduit was launching, they debuted another brand new property, the Grinder, at E3 2009. This horror-themed co-op shooter attempted to capitalize on the Conduit's hype, but ultimately failed to make it to market. Publishers weren't interested in funding it, despite High Voltage developing demos for 3 different potential versions of it. It was a costly experiment that ended up going nowhere and being shelved. Next came a sequel to the Conduit that also struggled behind the scenes. Financial issues had led to layoffs at the studio, which severely disrupted its development. With its sophomore entry suffering from numerous issues, the future of the series was cast into doubt. But as Conduit 2 neared its release date, an unexpected new opportunity arose for the Illinois-based developer in March 2011. According to several sources linked to High Voltage, Nintendo contacted them, expressing an interest in them developing an original first-party IP together. The game would be made at High Voltage Software by their staff, with Nintendo's oversight and funding. This proposal was the outcome of a strong relationship between the two parties. High Voltage had been developing exclusive original content for the Wii from the start, and this loyalty hadn't gone unnoticed at Nintendo. As far back as during work on the first Conduit game, they were providing the developers with early access to prototypes for technology like the Wii Motion Plus add-on. Early into their dialogue about producing this new game, Nintendo presented a vague outline for the project. According to members of the team that worked on it, they wanted a shooting game that the whole family could play. Their desire to create this style of game in particular was why High Voltage had been chosen for the task. They not only had experience in working on shooters, but also technology for making them already custom built for Nintendo hardware. As for their decision to target a broad family audience with the game, as opposed to more traditional fans of shooters, an ex-employee believes that Nintendo had identified a gap in their lineup, as well as the wider market, for a more accessible type of shooting game. How would they make this shooter for everyone? Nintendo had an answer to that as well, or rather the germ of an idea they thought High Voltage could expand upon themselves. Very simply, their suggestion was water guns. As opposed to conventional pistols and rifles, water guns would provide an alternative that would be less intimidating for family audiences. The rest, however, was up to High Voltage to figure out. Their creatives were left by Nintendo to determine how they would contextualize why water guns were being used in this game's world and which characters were using them. A small group of no more than 10 people was chosen to tackle this conundrum. The team, mostly a combination of designers and artists, would be led by Chief Creative Officer Eric Knopfsinger and Art Director Matt Corso. This duo was notable for leading the developer's biggest projects at the time, including both Conduit games as well as their ill-fated title The Grinder. From the beginning, it was being envisioned that their Nintendo project would follow in the footsteps of those games by being a first-person shooter. Between the members of High Voltage, it didn't take long for ideas to form about the characters in this world and why they would be using water for combat in the first place. Their concept was all about robots, mechanical beings that were susceptible to blasts of water which could fry their circuits and destroy them. During the fairly short period that the project was in the works, concept art was produced to illustrate some of these ideas. Unfortunately, much of what was made has since been lost, but a former artist from the studio agreed to recreate some of their work-in-progress concept art from it for the purposes of this video. According to them, the team was pulling inspiration from a variety of sources to realize the look of the game. Their characters were partly informed by designs from the Mega Man series and the 2005 animated movie Robots. The environment, on the other hand, looked to one of Nintendo's own titles, Super Mario Sunshine. With distinct similarities to one of that game's levels, Peanut Park, the world of High Voltage's game had a theme park style to it with water at its heart. One piece of art conveys the aesthetic they were aspiring towards, a crossroads between nature and machinery. Water was central to the game's premise, and that manifested itself in a more literal sense throughout its setting. We would have seen streams of water flowing through levels, with transportation powered by hydraulics. There was a sense that water was not only a means of war, but something that somehow fueled all facets of life for the robots inhabiting these lands. The robots themselves were planned to come in many different shapes and sizes. Some had wheels or extending arms, others had water guns literally bolted onto their bodies. There were also robots that would use everyday items to aid themselves in battle, like this one wearing a raincoat for protection. Water guns weren't the only weapons planned to be made available either. They were developing ideas for guns that used other liquids. One they had considered was a bazooka made from repurposed PVC pipe that would launch sewage. There was a weapon cobbled together from a chemistry set that fired hazardous chemicals, and a gun that could spray electrified water onto the battlefield. At the time, the game was not being thought of as a potential multiplayer juggernaut like Splatoon. While multiplayer had been discussed, they were more focused on nailing their core concept first. Some of the developers I was able to speak to about the Untitled project believed that it was set to move forward, and that Nintendo's interest in its concept was genuine. However, it was less than a month into this early form of pre-production when relations between High Voltage Software and Nintendo took a turn for the worse. On April 10th, 2011, word that the two were working together was leaked online by a High Voltage Software employee. This worker shared some details about their dealings with a popular Nintendo news outlet. What this site then posted was a list of rumors from them, including the claim that High Voltage had been sharing water assets with Nintendo for a new game. For the brief period it was available online, the article was dismissed by many as baseless, but behind the scenes, it had sent High Voltage into a panic. The studio had a leaker in their midst, and this was a major problem. The news had not escaped the watchful eye of Nintendo either. Their higher-ups were soon informed, and the company issued High Voltage with an ultimatum. High Voltage would need to learn who was responsible for this information getting out, and ensure that no further leaks would occur on their part. What followed was an extensive internal investigation to unmask the culprit. The article was swiftly pulled at the company's request, and each of their employees was spoken to individually. According to former workers, they were given assurances that they would not be fired if they came forward as the perpetrator. High Voltage refused to nominate a scapegoat and throw one of their own under the bus for the sake of the project's continuation. Despite their efforts, nobody claimed responsibility for the leak, and it would forever remain a mystery among High Voltage staff. During my own investigation into the events, I was able to pinpoint the source of the leak leak and discuss it with them directly. From speaking to the alleged leaker and others who were in contact with them at the time of the incident, I was able to determine that the leak was carried out maliciously, an act of defiance in response to what they believed were unsatisfactory working conditions they had experienced at High Voltage. Since the company was unable to pinpoint the source of the leak, Nintendo's higher-ups felt they had no choice other than to discontinue their project. Former developers from High Voltage say that Nintendo needed assurances that anything they were working on together would remain confidential. With an unknown leaker encroaching upon their negotiations at such an early stage, confidentiality was not something High Voltage could promise them. This was the end of the road for their short-lived first-party Nintendo project. What would have been a dream contract for many of those working on it lasted around only a month in total. Just days after this, the company launched Conduit 2 and faced further hardships. The game was nowhere near as successful as the original, selling poorly around the world. It marked the last project they would have published by Sega. Ex-employees claim that some internal pitches for Wii U games were made, but none of them moved forward. The failure of Conduit 2 and the demise of their Nintendo project in some ways spelled the end of the company's love affair with Nintendo hardware. They began to focus more on Xbox and PlayStation platforms, working on such games as Saints Row: Gat Out of Hell. In the years after their robot shooter project, rumours swirled around High Voltage that Nintendo had intentions of taking the core idea of a water gun game and developing it internally. 3 years later, when Splatoon was announced, many of High Voltage's staff believed that what they worked on back in 2011 was a far removed, early incarnation of those same basic ideas. According to Nintendo, Splatoon was born out of a 10-person team that produced a plethora of different game concepts in the search for a potential new IP. A prototype for a game where players control blocks of tofu emerged as the favourite. Players had to spray ink to cover as much ground as possible, and the team to cover the most turf would win. This was an early demo for what would eventually become Splatoon's Turf War mode. Nintendo itself has never acknowledged High Voltage Software's project, and neither companies have discussed it publicly. High Voltage declined to be a part of this video. For some developers, memories of the project are bittersweet. One source from the team expressed regret over not being able to make the game, but admitted they might never have been able to measure up to what Nintendo later accomplished with Splatoon. On the subject of the leak that brought the project down, they had this to say: "This happened 7 years ago, and the company is a third the size, with 80 to 90% turnover since then, and the fallout still weighs on the studio. I totally understand the ire of the person that leaked, but rather than sticking it to management, they screwed everyone at the studio for the better part of a decade." For more videos like this one, don't forget to subscribe. If you'd like to help me continue my research, consider supporting me on Patreon like these kind people did. I've been Liam, and I hope you'll join me for another Game History Secrets.